Thank you all for coming here this evening to remember and pay respects to the legendary Gary Mack. Tonight's program is a commemoration of his life, his incalculable role played in the research of President Kennedy's assassination, and above all, his contributions to the sixth floor over the last 27 years. Gary has left behind a legacy to inspire us all, and he has helped cast the careful presentation of this captivating piece of 20th century American history that will forever stimulate discussion and interest. Tonight, we will reveal many facets of Gary's accomplishments, a whimsical side, his love of music, his various likes and dislikes, his gingham-style shirts, his knack of wisecracks even during odd moments of duress. Some of you have ventured from both sides of the continental US to be here, to honor the fascinating man, to share your individual memories of how and when Gary impressed or influenced you in some unique way. Some of you know Gary Mack very well, and perhaps not so well as Lawrence Dunkel. Some of you here may also know each other very well and may be longtime friends or colleagues, and some of you may only know each other by name or reputation only. We hope tonight that you have the opportunity to meet Gary's family, to reconnect with old friends, and make new ones. Gary was in some ways an enigma. He was too, to some degree, a very private man, but he was very attached to his family. Karen Strobeck, Gary's marvelous wife, ensured that Gary was fun and happy during the times when he was not entirely absorbed by assassination research matters. We are honored to welcome Gary's family, his son Stephen Dunkel, and his sister Susan Coleman, as well as Karen's brother and sister-in-law Hank and Jean Strobeck. In fact, there's so many important people here tonight. The sixth floor's original co-founders and dynamic duo, Linda Lynn Adams and Conover Hunt, and without whom there would be no sixth floor museum. Alan and Cynthia Mondell, the original museum exhibit and documentary filmmakers who worked with Gary over the decades, are also here. The museum is fortunate to welcome many of our guests tonight who are literally eyewitnesses to history, and you all know who you are. But you have all valiantly supported the museum over the years. And we're also very grateful to welcome some of our most significant collections donors with whom Gary had built a very private and special bond. Even some of Gary's co-workers from his earlier TV and radio days are here. And tonight we salute some of our board members, past and present, and also many of the museum's former employees from long ago and not so long ago. Lastly, this museum is what it is now, not because of those who helped shape the past and preceded us, but because of also our current staff, the incredible team who come to work every day with supreme professionalism, passion, and commitment to filling the museum's mission and our exciting next phase of institutional growth. We all think that we know the man Gary Mack, but tonight I can guarantee you that you will all learn about the richer, deeper, funnier, kinder, brilliant researcher and truth seeker that Gary was. I worked with Gary for almost 10 years, and I never stopped wondering about what it was that really drove him to pursue this research in such an all-consuming manner. One could say that a lot of us here are truly OCD, but Gary was extraordinarily focused, deliberate, and stubbornly single-minded. On the eve of the 50th, it was suddenly all crystallized for me when he blurted out, "Nicola, you just do not understand. I am part of the story." This consideration had never entered my mind. Until then, he was always illuminating. The loss we all share is that his deep knowledge is gone, and that all those creative thoughts and insights that were not all documented before he left us. He was the go-to resource, our instant reference book, always willing to share his opinion when asked, and even when not. He was emphatic about what was right, wrong, off course, or just plain silly. and he would certainly ignore participation in museum and mission-related projects that were of no personal interest to him or relevance, and that did not help shed light on any new understanding or angle of an assassination topic. But he was so very proud to have been associated with the sixth floor, and his stamina, his loyalty, his passion was plain infectious. Remarkably, Gary did not take sides with any of the local broadcast networks or journalists, but he did especially value his connection to a few media colleagues, and with whom he shared a common understanding. One of these longtime and deeply trusted individuals is Richard Ray of Fox 4. Richard has been kind enough to give up this evening's broadcast to be with us here tonight to lead this evening's program, so please join me in welcoming Richard Ray.
Thank you, Nicola. You know, whether you're a family member, a friend, or a colleague, you come here tonight to honor the memory and the legacy of Gary Mack. For Gary, being curator of this marvelous museum was a dream job. It was his calling, and he really was the perfect person for it. No one on the planet was more passionate in discerning the truth about what really happened that day in 1963. No one pursued the truth more thoroughly. No one sought to preserve the evidence with more detail and more carefully. I was blessed to work with Gary in a couple of documentary projects in the late 1990s and early 2000. We won some awards, but more than that, we forged a friendship that lasted, and one that I really valued. That friendship spanned nearly 20 years, and Nicola beat me to it when she said that he really was the go-to guy. I leaned on Gary so many times, and journalists all across the globe leaned on Gary if there was some new conspiracy, if there was a name that was brought up that I didn't recognize. I would call Gary, I would email Gary. Gary would know, and he always did. You could trust him. He would give you, okay, here's the documentation on it. Find out for yourself. And I valued that so much. The loss is much greater, of course, for his family. And again, Karen, thank you for asking me to be part of this, for Stephen and Susan and all the family members. I'm honored to be here. I know the loss is great for you, and my condolences. And for the museum family, Nicola and Megan and Stephen, I know it's a loss for you as well, a very personal loss. But tonight we also celebrate the life of our friend, our colleague, and our family member, the life of Gary Mack. We celebrate the life of Gary Mack, and what a memorable life it was.
My name is Gary Mack, G-A-R-Y-M-A-C-K. I'm the curator at the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. I live in Arlington, Texas, as of a couple weeks ago.
My first recollection of Gary goes back to a pamphlet he produced that, in fact, he had me in, which had to do with the supposed three hobos at the Triple Underpass.
We actually met in August of 1990. We found out the three things we had in common were the Kennedy assassination, golf, and rock and roll. And what would happen is we would go out on the weekends and we'd play golf. He was a member at a golf course over in Fort Worth, and we'd discuss the Roscoe White story in between shots.
I remember vividly the first time I met Gary Mack. It was August of 2000. We officed in the basement in those days, and Gary had an office on the far end. You had to walk down this long sort of corridor in the basement to get to his little cubicle. And I remember being taken down there and the anticipation building as I walked down this little stretch to get to meet Gary Mack for the first time. And there he was in the flesh, and I extended my hand and I said, "It is an honor to meet you." And he said, "Rrr," and shook my hand, and that was it. That was our first meeting. He had very little time for me at all because I was just one of many young interns coming through the museum at that time.
Well, Gary and I met when I was working in Fort Worth, and there was a position that came open here at the museum, and I applied for it and came over and I was interviewed. And Gary told me later that he said, I was watching you the whole time, and after you left, the first thing I did was go to HR and say, can I date employees here? So,
when the sixth floor exhibit was being developed, starting in the late 1970s, Conover Hunt was the project director, and she was looking for a wide variety of individuals who could contribute their knowledge to this very controversial story.
Being in charge of the curation was not an easy situation. And Gary Mack was involved. He was one of our curators.
Gary Mack was one of about 27 individuals that really helped shape the content of the sixth floor. Conover went to Gary specifically because he had vast knowledge of the films and photographs taken in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination. And it was a big point of pride for Gary that he was part of that team. And it really brought him full circle when he was able to join the staff here as archivist in the 90s, because he had been involved in the 80s about 10 years earlier.
After he left KXAS, he came to the sixth floor. And because we were involved in really destroying the Roscoe White story, word got out that I was sent here from Langley, Virginia, in order to turn him to anti-conspiracy. And the reward for my efforts was I got him the job at the sixth floor. And you were talking about how every once in a while we'd get crossways. Well, we'd be sitting having a beer and we'd be arguing over the merits of something or else, and I'd say to him, you know, I got you that job. I can call my handlers and have you removed.
I know that this museum meant so much to him, and perhaps one of the reasons I have become so passionate and dedicated to this place is because of that passion that Gary felt, and because in emulating Gary and looking up to him as a mentor, what he cared about, I eventually cared about too.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sixth Floor Museum on this, our 25th anniversary.
When he left Channel 5 and came to work here at the sixth floor, I mean, you could have knocked a lot of us over. I mean, you know, it's like, you know, and some of his pals, he's gone to the dark side, you know. But, you know, it was a tailor-made job for Gary Mack. It was his life.
He was very careful to always guard his role at the Sixth Floor Museum as curator. And I don't think he ever gave me any exclusives or any shortcuts to it, but he trusted me, and he trusted my word, and I valued that.
Gary and I definitely like to think of each other as work brother and sister. In the early days, I was probably pretty shy about disagreeing with Gary, but as I got more and more comfortable, not at all. And he certainly, as the opinionated and passionate person that he was not shy about expressing his displeasure or disagreement with something. So that led to us bickering like siblings.
I remember when they were doing the renovation projects, the first phase originally, and then the phase right before the 50th anniversary, and we would go out there, and inevitably I would be the photographer with the digital camera, and Gary would point at stuff. And there was one picture in particular where we're standing on the north side of Elm Street, and Gary is smiling at me, and he's pointing at something on the ground, and his shadow is casting it. And it was such a great picture that for a couple of years in a row, I sent that around to our department and said, Happy Groundhog's Day, because it was like Gary was pointing to his shadow that he would see on Groundhog's Day. And Gary found that amusing, at least the first time.
Behind every great man, there is a great woman, and Gary was great in so many ways. And when he left work, he went home to an incredibly special woman who helped ground him.
At home, he would rarely talk about it. He needed a break, and so we enjoyed watching old black and white movies from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and that was our routine. We'd come home and sit in the den, and we had our own favorite chairs, and that was our outlet. We just enjoyed being together. He was a good friend, and we just liked each other besides loving each other. When he would come home, we would have the dinner and the movie, but then he would go into the man cave and again would be searching JFK news groups. He was always just passionate about it, and it was his life.
In the days following Gary's passing last month, there were a lot of folks on there saying, God, he was just answering a question for me a few days ago, or he said he was going to look into this and get back to me. And, he was doing that while just in those last days, answering those questions and making sure he could help with information until the very last.
Yes, there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there, but he still wanted to hear those because you never know if a particular idea or thought, or he was so very much into not just believing what he believed, but what other people thought. People whose ideas he thought maybe a little radical, he still wanted to listen to it. And his passion was finding the truth.
How many think Lee Harvey Oswald did it all by himself? It's okay to say what you think. And how many folks think there was more to it than Lee Harvey Oswald? All right.
I want to say this about Gary. I don't think I will ever meet anyone in this work that I do that was more incredible in terms of fact-checking, getting the information correct.
I'm just so sad to lose him because he was a friend and he was such a tremendous asset to this organization.
He was a walking, talking encyclopedia about the Kennedy assassination. That was his life. That was Gary Mack's life.
He always had an open mind, and he was always looking for more information. He was always looking for that extra piece of the puzzle.
Gary wouldn't shoot down anything. He would entertain it and then try to knock it down, or if he couldn't knock it down, you got something there.
I worked on a documentary for the 50th anniversary, and not only did Gary give me everything I asked for and permission for everything I asked for, but he even said, here's something new we got that no one has seen. You might be interested in this. So he was helpful and just always pursuing every lead.
The first documentary that we did, JFK, the Dallas Tapes, as reported when it happened, did win an Emmy, and I'm very proud of it. I love that piece.
I worked with him very closely when producing a series that aired on both WBAP and KLIF news radio stations, our JFK 50 series that I'm proud to say went on to win an Edward R. Murrow Award. And of course, Gary, along with several other people, were a very important part of that series.
I always tell people I'm really not a JFK expert. I just play one on TV. Gary was the expert. And then he would always add, too, that he's the guy that taught Rich Ray how to spell JFK.
One of our ongoing projects here at the museum is, of course, our dynamic and ongoing oral history project where we seek interviews with people from around the world about their memories of the assassination. Gary participated in a few of these, particularly if it was a key eyewitness or someone that he knew personally. I know one of the first ones he did was the Towner family, Jim, Pat, and Tina Towner, and Gary was part of that oral history recording in 1996.
My name is Gary Mack. Could the three of you give us an idea of how long the shooting lasted? Could you decide, could you make a sound and kind of maybe come to some kind of agreement about how fast or slow the shots were, and were some of the shots closer together than the other shots?
The Towner family, they were eyewitnesses on the corner of Elm and Houston Street, to the eyewitnesses to the assassination, and both Tina, as a 12-year-old, and her father had cameras. And Gary had cultivated a long relationship with the Towner family.
Gary was instrumental in establishing these very personal relationships where a long history of trust was built. And without him, we wouldn't have the collections that we have today.
The Towner collection had been in the care of the museum for, since 1995 or 6. And the cameras were on display upstairs.
It took me a while to realize how long it took to build those relationships. And sometimes he was tight-lipped about those relationships. But in the end, the donors always came through.
Just earlier this year, in the first part of 2015, Tina did officially donate everything. Gary shepherded that through. It was very important to him. He had a long-standing friendship with Tina. We were all very glad to see that happen, and I think Tina was especially as well.
Okay, testing level. Remembering Officer J.D. Tippit, moderated. Oh boy. Remembering Officer J.D. Tippit, How we doing there, boss? All right. All right. Well, now I can't read the words. I guess I'll have to cancel.
I remember him being very supportive of getting the Tippett family, and I know that as I'm speaking for the Tippett family, they always appreciated Gary's passion.
Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Hugh Aynesworth, and our guests, the Tippett family, Marie, Brenda, and Curtis.
That was a heartfelt introduction, and I know, as we all do, we keep Mrs. Tippett near and dear to our heart, as we do all the people that lost, as we do Mrs. Kennedy, who lost her husband that day. And dear Gary's passion showed that night, and I said I was glad to have been there and helped been part of that.
Another interview that I remember Gary being involved in was an eyewitness who remembered seeing the motorcade as it emerged from the triple underpass. And I remember this one vividly because Gary became fixated with this man's story. His name was James Owen. And after the oral history, we actually walked out to Dealey Plaza with Mr. Owen because Gary was adamant about pinpointing the exact spot where he was standing when he saw the motorcade come out from under the triple underpass.
This is where you were standing. I would have searched this. That's one trick I would have. You focus on Kennedy's. What they bought for the equipment. And you weren't paying attention to the others. You were staring into Kennedy's car.
I think the story I will always remember is from just a couple of years ago when we were covering the 50th anniversary. And Gary took me down into the basement of our old building in East Fort Worth. Down into the bowels of Channel 5.
Down a steep flight of stairs and a dim concrete corridor is a door that leads deep into the past.
And so here it is, room number 8.
Yeah. After you, sir.
We opened up this creaky door and went into this musty storage room, and Gary showed me where the original film was from that day. And I felt like he was sharing the map to the buried treasure. And I will never forget that.
Most TV stations across the country threw out all their old news film. Channel 5 saved it all.
Once he convinced, and once the museum convinced the TV stations in town to turn over that becomes a resource that for generations will always be here. And that really that's a big part of his legacy.
I actually saw Gary get excited a lot because he and I would get excited about the same weird little things. When, for example, we found out that a French reporter, Francois Pelloux, who had covered the assassination, was going to be coming to Dallas, we both got really excited. No one else in the office had ever heard of Francois Pelloux, but he appears in so many of the films and photographs at Dallas Police Headquarters that weekend that it was like a rock star coming to the 6th Floor Museum. And Gary and I, we were there, we did the oral history, we took him to Sonny Bryan's for barbecue, and there's a great picture that I really like, and we're walking back from Sonny Bryan's, and it's me and Gary and Francois Pelloux. And Gary has just made some crack about me being a whippersnapper who wasn't even alive when Kennedy was shot. And I fired back something and I called him Grandpa. And there's an expression on his face, which I'm so glad it was captured in a photograph, because it was the sort of like funny irked face he would make when I would say something that he probably should have gotten upset about, but he didn't get upset about, maybe because it was me who said it, but it's just one of those moments frozen in time. The other picture, probably the picture that means the most to me, was a moment that was snapped at 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 2003, the 40th anniversary of the assassination. There's this moment of silence in Dealey Plaza, and I'm standing there next to the United Nations Ambassador William Vanden Heuvel, who was here as our guest for a program. And unbeknownst to me, when this picture was taken, Gary is standing directly behind me, and in this photograph, his arm is raised, he's in the middle of a thought, and he's explaining some aspect of some theory to somebody. And it's just a perfect moment, because here we are in the midst of this moment of silence, and I am thinking about the Kennedy assassination. And Gary's talking about Badge Man or the single bullet theory or something right behind me.
I know Gary was difficult to work with, and I don't see that as a negative. He was protective of his archive. He wanted it done the right way. He built it from scratch. He wanted to maintain an archive that would outlive him, and it has. And at times that made him maybe an abrasive person to some other people. And I think that's part of his integrity that is now part of our history.
The other thing I remember, which I thought was kind of funny, is he looked at me and he said, "Dave, Karen says we're famous. Are we famous?" And I said, "Gary, you're famous. I'm not famous."
I can't believe he's gone. While we had animated conversations, I will miss, in part, his direction and his viewpoints, which always helped inform the final decision that we were making on any particular issue, whether it was with the press, a particular aspect of an item perhaps coming up for auction, the statements that the museum was going to say publicly about our interest in anything. So I'm going to miss that.
Mentors and friends, there's never enough time. There's never enough time with these folks that mean this much to you. But looking back on it, minute for minute, hour for hour, I spent more time with Gary Mack in 15 years than I did my own family. And I am eternally grateful for every silly, poignant, dramatic, politically incorrect moment that we shared together. And he has left me a richer and vastly amplified individual. And that means so much to me.
It seems funny to say that I already miss it, is that God, it seems really silly to say this, but the constant emails with notifying me to what he thought might be a copyright infringement or correcting me on something, I already miss that. I keep expecting to see those, and it's a funny thing to miss, but that's one of the things I'm going to miss.
He was irreplaceable. He was just a truly unique individual, a mystery in many ways, frustrating and lovable at the same time.
Karen called me that morning and said, "This is the call you don't want to get." And I had trouble. I had about 3 days of trouble after that because we were so tight.
All he would talk about toward the end was, I really don't want this story to ever go away. He said, we need to find out the truth. And he said, I hate that I'm not going to be here to help find that. And so it was more his passion if he wants the museum to just be so wonderful as it is now, the way it's in context now. But to never stop asking questions, to never give up asking for donations, root around in the dresser drawer, he would always say, and pull out a film, and all of a sudden there it is. And now it wasn't so much that, it was the museum. He really he said, I want the museum to have a wonderful program for the next 50 years. And that's what he wanted to call the program. This was the day before he died, and he was talking about the museum. You know, we should have a program that says the next 50 years, and we should have so-and-so and so-and-so on it. And here he is laying there, and it was really literally less than 24 hours before he passed away. But it was his love. And thinking of these things, being the producer person that he was, you know, this gave him a great sense of relief, a great sense of that he still mattered.
At least 500 years from now, people will at least be able to see the films and photographs. They'll still be around, or the latest digitized version of them will still be around. That makes me feel good.
That's marvelous, and that captures so much. And I think Andy and Steve and everybody who had anything to do with putting that video together, thank you very much. I feel a little bit like a brown shoes at a black tie event because we've got some really distinguished people here that I want to bring up to help remember Gary Mack. First of all, the Vice President of Programming at NBC5, Gary and this TV executive go back a very long way to when Gary worked at Channel 5 KXAS. Please welcome Brian Hocker.
Thank you very much, Richard, Nicola, for the introductions. I thought I was on solid emotional footing until I watched the tribute video, and I'm not sure this list of folks can out-tribute the tribute video, but I'm honored to be here. I am with NBC5, Channel 5 locally. I'm happy to say a number of my coworkers are with me today. We all love Gary dearly. And it goes back to 1991, actually. 1991, when Gary was hired by NBC5. And I was not at the station back then, but I will tell you, Bobby Wygant, who has been our longtime entertainment reporter, who was with us the first day we signed on in the 40s and still does work for us today, she remembers Gary fondly from them. And she said back then, she knew of no one, and Bobby Wygant knows a lot of notable people, I will tell you. She knows of no one with a greater sense of history at that point in time than Gary Mack. That's no surprise to any of us now. Gary was hired as a booth announcer. So back then, television stations had live announcers available to go on the air at any hour of the day, and he was one of two booth announcers. Apparently, throughout his life, he worked in a small space because from what I saw in the tribute video, the announcer booth was quite small. But we remember Gary set up in his announce booth, much like you saw there, a reel-to-reel film viewer so that he could go down in the basement, which you saw in the tribute, bring it back up and look at the film and begin to catalog it and make sense to all of it. Of course, that's where he began, I believe, to get access to individuals who actually took part in the coverage back then of the JFK assassination because they still worked at Channel 5. It was it was less than 20 years in the past. So I joined Channel 5 in 1986, actually, so not too long after Gary. I was a 20-something, excited to get into TV. I don't think I really knew much about the history of the station or really probably cared about it. But I do remember Gary as just like a terrific coworker, right? So here's this guy at the water cooler who just like knows everything. And I mean, this is 1986. It was like having Gary Google, in the building. I mean, people would go to him for just facts and information. And he wasn't afraid to speak up. So from his production role, he would be known to correct, a producer or a writer here or there, heaven forbid, an anchor, just after they come off air and fact check them. But that's what made Gary great, and that's something that made us as an organization great, right? And that carries through, obviously, to this day. So Gary and I, became fast friends just because we kind of liked eclectic things and talking about anything. And Gary left us, went on to the 6th floor. I remained at Channel 5. And we stayed in contact. And, what he realized is that my interest in history of WBAP grew through the years, and largely to Gary giving me the insight to our past and what the station meant to this community. We spent many a days on the phone talking about what was in our basement. And Gary was determined from the day he walked in Channel 5 to preserve that for posterity. And we all know, when Gary got something in his mind and wanted to preserve something, I mean, he was like a dog on a bone. And we had many a conversation about what we were going to do. And I will tell you, I have come to so value the history of our station and worked so hard with Gary to be able to preserve that legacy that we have in the basement that you saw. And we eventually did get it to a good, safe home. I will tell you, though, in preparing my remarks, you're going to obviously hear a lot about history and his passion for history and what he did here. But one word kept coming back into my mind, and that was gentleman. I will tell you, I'm sure he raised his voice here or there and had his headstrong ways. But in my dealings with Gary, he was never anything less than a true gentleman. He was sincere. He was compassionate of others. And he was he was a wonderful soul. And I'm grateful for that. My regret is that I didn't say thank you enough. I knew the man for over 30 years. And he helped me personally and Channel 5 immeasurably. And he deserves thanks 1,000 times over. I regret that I didn't get to say thank you. You know, I do want to say thank you to the 6th floor for giving him such an amazing environment, venue to do what turned out to be his life's work. And of course, I want to say thank you to his family, Karen and Stephen and Susan. I know you helped shape Gary, and I'm grateful for you sharing him with us all these wonderful years. Thank you.
Conover Hunt is a historian and original content creator at the 6th floor exhibit then, before it was a museum. A real developer and a project director here, very much a founder of this place. And she has come all the way from Virginia to be with us tonight. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to welcome Conover Hunt.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here with old friends, new friends, and to honor Gary. An extraordinary man. Now, what I don't understand is all of you all talking about him being difficult. I was trained as a curator. I never thought he was difficult. He probably thought, I don't know, maybe all of you all thought I was difficult, and I probably am. But curators are difficult people because to be a great curator, you have to have passion. And the ingredients that I saw in Gary Mack, we met in the late 70s when I was first involved as a consultant to what would become the 6th floor exhibit, to what would become the 6th floor museum at Dealey Plaza, to what would become a National Historic Landmark District. And as was said earlier, I reached out to 27 subject experts on all sides of the debate about the assassination. Who shot John? Who was behind who shot John? Did anybody shoot John? Gary was one of the ones that I asked to come in and help us put together a fair history of the history of a globally troubling event. And he did. There was a dinner party at my house then on the M Streets where we had the director of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. We had an FBI medical artist. We had Gary. We had, the great Mary Farrell. And we had others. We had some very outspoken researchers on conspiracy in the assassination. And we had some militant, pro-government, we got it right to begin with people. And my good friend Meg Reed's daughter was then about 6 years old. And she came in and she said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, Elizabeth, we're all here to talk about the death of the president, who unfortunately died before you were born." And she went up to the head of the select committee and she said, "Well, who did shoot President Kennedy?" And he looked down and blinked, like, this is really why we're all here, is to educate this next generation. And he said, "A very bad man." And the forces of evil that were behind a very bad man we can talk about all day long, but it's people who commit murder. And this is what happened in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. I stayed involved with the sixth floor as project director, chief curator, historian, blah, 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 on and on, from 1978 until 1996, when I did my final retirement. And during that period, I was involved as a consultant. And I know that Dave Perry has taken credit for getting Gary the job, but Dave, you're going to have to share it with me. Because I knew what a curator is, and I knew that getting the sixth floor open would be Lindaland's and my greatest contribution to American history. But somebody was going to have to make it respected. Somebody was going to have to be there putting in untold man years behind the scenes, answering questions, following the rules of historiography in their search for the truth, never proselytizing, never screaming in frustration, never jumping out a window. And I thought Gary had the unique talents for that. First of all, he had the most prodigious photographic memory about the assassination I've ever seen and doubt anyone has ever seen. He worked with me as chief curator in putting together the sixth floor content, which was 100 pages long. And I would go to him and say, Gary, the Warren Commission exhibits have 3 different times that Officer Tippit was shot. And which one is it? He says, well, Auntie Con, we're just going to have to talk about this and decide what is the truth. And that's what he was after. And historians are always searching for the truth. I was so pleased to hear Gary say in the film that having preserved the films, the photographs, advised countless authors, journalists, you name it, film producers, about what we know is the truth as opposed to what we can't be sure about. He realized that the true gift a historian can give to the future is through a museum where you have collected these materials, loved every one of them. His turf had to be protected. All curators are like that as well, and it's one of the reasons people think we're difficult. But he got it. He understood the contribution he was making, and he understood that long after Gary and I are pushing up daisies, and he beat me to it by a little bit, those films, those collections, that mantra to be fair, not to dictate, will remain as an integral part of the philosophy of the Sixth Floor Museum. Thank you, Gary. Thank you all.
Thank you, Conover. The next man is another that I am really proud to call my friend. He's a legendary newsman and author, and no one can write more authoritatively about JFK than this man. He was there at every key event that weekend. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Hugh Aynesworth.
You know, Gary and I, you have to excuse my voice, my allergies have got me today, but Gary and I came from different directions. He believed in conspiracy, and I'd seen enough of what happened that I didn't. And we became friends later out of, I think, respecting each other. As he grew into the very important role here at the sixth floor, we often talked about specific parts of the JFK puzzle, the rifle, the various eyewitnesses, the government mess-ups, obvious fakers that made up things, so on. We often discussed the Garrison Shaw case in New Orleans. Though he didn't get to cover that, he was vitally interested in it. And I explained to him the reasons why Garrison was really the only criminal in that vendetta down there. Gary had some trouble believing how bizarre the Garrison case was, until I played him several tapes, interviews that I'd done with Garrison, which veered rather wildly from known facts in the Dallas end of the case. He particularly enjoyed hearing Garrison tell me that the, quote, real shooter had been in the sewer that afternoon out here in Dealey Plaza. And I told Garrison that the sewer was only 10 inches in diameter. And Gary roared with laughter as he heard Garrison tell me, well, he said, there's some awfully small men in America, and they're madder than hell. Those who knew him best, as many have related already, will recall the passion and the verve he put into everything he investigated. In later years, I found myself often checking things with Gary when I wasn't sure about who had done what to whom and where they were, because I knew that he had been scouring photographs and television footage for years and often knew who was standing beside whom or who was in front of whom. I greatly admired his sense of humor, his ability to listen and show respect for even the wildest theories, something that admittedly I had long since hesitated to do. Many times I was amazed at his knowledge. Like the time I told him over lunch that 4 people had confessed to me they shot the president. And another claimed his father did it. Without hesitation, Gary looked at me and said, oh, you mean so-and-so and so-and-so, and he named all 4 of them. Now, what was amazing about this to me was I had never written about 3 of these people. I'd never talked about it. I'd never mentioned their bizarre claims anywhere and how he knew, but he knew. He'd got into something. He knew who was doing what to whom, who was saying what, and how legitimate it was. He had it all in his head. But 3 or 4 years ago, I did manage to get one thing by him. Ruth Payne, the woman who took in Oswald's wife and family in her Irving home right before the assassination, was visiting Dallas, and she and her friend over dinner one night told Paula and me that she would love to come to the 6th floor museum. But she was a little afraid. She was anticipatory that it might cause some distraction, some embarrassment, or maybe some problem. I told her I'd take her to the 6th floor museum. Next day, Paula and I met her and a friend in the lobby here. First person I saw was Gary Mack. When he saw me, he left the 2 or 3 people he was talking to, and he came up to greet me. He said, what are you doing here? And I saw him coming, and I told Mrs. Payne to ease away from me a little bit, which she did. Gary and I chatted a few moments, and he went back to his guests, and I never told him that Ruth Payne was here. Naturally, in more than an hour that she spent here, she was tremendously touched, very impressed with his fine museum. And someday I hope she'll be invited here to talk and relate about those days. But back to Gary Mack, I know his family and friends grieve and realize what they've lost with his passing. But what future generations lost will probably never be adequately calculated. Thank you for the honor of allowing me to share my thoughts about a gentleman that I admired so much.
Our next speaker is a JFK researcher who may have had just about as much passion for this subject as Gary did. In fact, that's, I think, what made them such longtime friends. He was a former, well, he'll tell you about it, former insurance investigator who had a passion for JFK, and the 2 of them did clash heads every now and again, but they were the dearest of friends, and again, I'm proud to say he's my friend as well. Please welcome Dave Perry.
Well, thank you for having me. I'd rather not be here, I guess, but I knew Gary for about 25 years, And I need to give you a little background because a lot of you probably don't know who I am or where I came from. I moved here in the mid-1980s from upstate New York and ended up working for an insurance company as a regional operations manager. At the time, Gary Mack was at KXAS. Both Gary and I were pro-conspiracy. On a scale from 1 to 10, I was probably a 7, and he was a 9.5. I don't know if you know this or not, but in the 80s, he was publishing a newsletter called Cover-Ups, which just about gave his participation in this whole business. What happened was I was also a volunteer behind there was a little group that had an office down in the West End called the JFK Assassination Information Center. And this was the hotbed of every pro-conspiracy person in the country, including all of the major authors. And since I worked behind the counter, I got invited to a press conference that they were holding in August of 1990, in which they had a young man by the name of Ricky White and a whole crew of people get up and make the claim that his father was the grassy knoll assassin, and also his father shot J.D. Tippit. Well, during the course of the press conference, because I did have some background, I've been working on this thing since 1976, he made a lot of statements that did not make a lot of sense. Well, the following day, they decided they were going to have a big meeting over in Arlington about this, and I went over there with one of the pro-conspiracy authors, a fellow named Robert Groden, who wrote a book called High Treason. And when we were over there, he introduced me to Gary Mack. I never met Gary, but after a few minutes of chatting about other stuff other than the Kennedy assassination, we found out that we had a big interest in golf. He liked light beer, I liked dark beer. We liked greasy hamburgers from a place over in Arlington called Airways. And we also liked 1960s rock and roll. I eventually found out he had a past as a disc jockey. Well, we hit it off right away, and I started telling him there were a lot of problems with his story, and we started calling each other up. And we got actually into investigating this thing, actually for the sake of Roscoe White's mother, who was very upset that her son was being accused by her grandson and his wife. At any rate, we were working on this. We were developing information, and around December, we were talking with each other every day. Matter of fact, my wife, Nikki, started complaining that we were like a couple of high school girls every night getting on the phone and yakking to each other about this thing. Well, we'd been talking, and I told him, I said, you know, I don't know if you saw it because you were at Channel 5, but they interviewed some people the night of this press conference, and there was a fellow over there by the name of Hugh Aynesworth who was on the television, and he was talking about how he thought that this was a big hoax. And I'll tell you what, Gary, I've decided, I've called him up, I cold called him, and he has decided to meet me for lunch. And Gary said, oh my God, do you know who that is? I said, yeah, his name is Hugh Aynesworth. He said, he is the most rabid anti-conspiracy person on the planet. You don't need to go near him. You need to stay away from him. And I said, he got so upset, he finally said, look at his telephone number. And I looked down, and Hugh's telephone number ended in 666. So, at any rate, I went over and I interviewed Hugh, and then I think it took me about 1.5 years to get Gary into the position where he would actually stand beside Hugh Aynesworth. But eventually, he came around and he understood what we were after. So as we were working on the Roscoe White story, we had some very entertaining moments. He had a really good sense of humor. It was almost like you had to really get to know him because we would argue back and forth about all things Kennedy. I mean, it was impossible to get together with him without him getting on the subject. He would lead you that way. I mean, I'd be in the middle of a golf shot, and he'd, wait, remember what so-and-so said? Well, at any rate, we were working on this, and I eventually found out that this Ricky White claimed that his father was killed by a CIA assassin who lived in East Texas. So I pulled a cold call. I talked to the person, and I said, we'd like to come over and interview you to get some information. So I called Gary up, and Gary was getting phone calls from some of his friends, including some of you remember Mary Farrell. And he said, do you know that this man lives in an armed compound? I thought, gee, that's pretty interesting. So with real trepidation, we drove over, and we found out that this fellow was a blueberry farmer. And when we came back, we were laughing all the way back on this because he had such a good time with us that he loaded the car up with jams and jellies. And as we were going through this, all of a sudden Gary realized that a lot of the conspiracy theories that he was involved with all had kind of feet of clay. And the sad part about it is a lot of the big-name researchers who we originally looked up to ended up trying to sell the Roscoe White story to Hollywood for a substantial amount of money. But by that time, Gary and I working together, we had completely blown the story out of the water. As a matter of fact, in one of the books, Oliver Stone references the work we did, claiming it was a publicity-seeking hoax, which made Roscoe's mother happy. And I think he also saw at that point how lives were damaged by all of these crazy conspiracy theories that were coming along. Well, over the years, and I knew Gary for almost 25 years, all of them great. We spent a lot of time playing golf, hit the ball, talk about Roscoe White, hit the ball, talk about Roscoe White. But we worked on probably 13 or 14 of these, and as time went by, the two of us came to the conclusion that half of these lies they're telling aren't true. And then what happened was, all of a sudden Gary tells me he's got the job at the 6th Floor Museum. Well, that was when we broke out the champagne, because there was nobody on the planet that I thought deserved this job more than anybody. But the other problem was shortly thereafter, he comes to me because there's a thing out there called the Kennedy News Groups, which people are passing back and forth. And he comes back to me and he says, I didn't know who you were. I thought you, in your previous life, you were an insurance adjuster from upstate New York. I didn't realize that you were actually a covert CIA agent from Langley, Virginia. And he actually started telling me about this. And over a period of time, originally I was a disinformation agent sent to Dallas to turn Gary to the dark side. Somewhere along the line, somebody promoted me because then I became a disinformation specialist. So I think my GAO number went up from 11 to 12, and I was getting more money. But he was the one that came to me and said, hey, Dave, you got me the job at the 6th Floor Museum. And I said, well, I never really wanted to tell you. But so every once in a while when we get in a fight or an argument over something, which we did off and on, it would come down to, Gary, I'll get you out of there in a New York City minute if you don't lean in with me. The other thing that happened, it was about 2003. I think it was about May of 2003. My wife, Nikki, and I got a call from Gary, and he invited us to dinner over in Riata in Fort Worth because he had met a woman that he was very interested in. So Nikki and I are driving over there, and Nikki looks at me and she says, what has she got to do with the Kennedy assassination? Was she on the grassy knoll? So we get over into Riata, and that was the first time we met Karen. And I don't know if Karen even knows this, but we're sitting around there, and Karen got up to go to the restroom, and she said to Nikki, would you want to come with me? usually in that situation, people would say yes. Nikki said no. Karen got up and walked off. Nikki looked at Gary and said, "She is a keeper. Don't screw this up with that Kennedy crap." So the thing about it is, over a period of time, I think we had a lot of great times together. I mean, we did a lot of double dating and that kind of stuff. She was a baseball nut, or she is a baseball nut as we are. We tried to convert Gary, but I just don't think he'd have any part of it. But it was a great time. I mean, he's a good friend. We used to talk on a slow time. We'd be talking once a week about something. And I will deeply miss him, and I'm glad that I had the opportunity to spend time with him. And thank you all.
Tom Jennings is a film producer from Los Angeles. The documentary, The Lost JFK Tapes, was a major collaboration that involved a lot of time working with Gary, deep interaction and major trust, I know. So will you please welcome Tom Jennings.
Thank you all very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and share these thoughts about Gary. The one thing I want to say about Gary to start with is Gary changed my life, and once he changed my life, he threw a party to celebrate changing my life, and I'll explain what that means. In the mid-1990s, I was working as a newspaper reporter in Los Angeles, and for many reasons I got into documentary filmmaking. And the first job I was offered was with a production company that was doing a show for the Discovery Channel called Rivals. Rivals is a show kind of like Biography, but with two people instead of one. A good example would be Rivals, George Wallace and Dr. Martin Luther King. This company hired the new guy to do the one show that no one wanted to do. And it was Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. And the problem was they weren't rivals. They had never met before. There was no connection between the two, unless you wanted to believe some of the conspiracy theories. So I said, I don't know what to do. And they said, well, if you want the job, you have to figure out how to make a rivalry between Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. So I called Gary and I explained who I was and what I was doing. And the first thing out of his mouth is he said, well, you know, Tom, they weren't rivals. You know, they. And I told him what I had to do. And he said, I have a piece of footage for you, and this will help. And he sent to me a piece of footage of Jack Ruby in the hallway of the Dallas police station the Friday night after the assassination, where you can see where Jack Ruby carries his .38 caliber gun in his waistband, and he's outside the room where Lee Harvey Oswald is standing. He said, not a lot of people know about this piece of footage, but there. It's 2 days earlier. Obviously, Ruby was doing something in advance, so that makes him a rival. So I was able to do it, and what happened was Gary sent me a lot of footage that I was able to look at, and I'd never seen it before. And I was amazed, and I said, you know, Gary, we could do a whole show with no narration and no interviews. You could just let this play as if it's happening in real time, to edit it in a way that makes sense for an audience, but to let it play. And he said, you're right. And I told him that one of my favorite shows when I was a child was a CBS show called You Are There, which was the CBS News division doing shows using the CBS News staff, people like Walter Cronkite, but broadcasting stories from long, long ago. I remember one of my favorite episodes was Dan Rather being on the deck of the Titanic as it was going down, and Walter Cronkite talking to him about what he was going to do, but somehow Dan Rather survived. And but I love the show because what they were trying to do is put the viewer, put children, it was a children's show, but anyone could watch it, in the place of someone who was watching it with media at the time. And I wanted to do the same thing with Gary's collection. And he said, great, let's try it. So I started to pitch the show, and the networks said no, because audiences would not understand a show that had no narrator and no interviews. They needed people to explain what they were seeing in order for it to make sense. And it took more than a dozen years of off and on. I worked with Gary on other projects, used footage and stills from his collection. And finally he said, Tom, you're just going to have to show them. So he sent me some of his best stuff that he hadn't shown before that I was able to edit together into a 10-minute reel. And one of the executives from National Geographic Channel was in Los Angeles for a conference, and I stalked him, and I got him at his hotel, and I said, look, just watch 10 minutes of this. Because he knew about what the idea was, and he was somewhat favorable to it. He sat down, he watched it in his room. Fortunately, there was a DVD player. He said nothing. It was finished. He said, let's do this show. The head of the network only wanted to do 1 hour. This executive took that 10 minutes in that Gary had helped me put together. After 10 minutes, they made it a 2-hour show. So I went from no one believing in this to finally, with Gary's help, having a 2-hour program on National Geographic. And Gary premiered the film here 6 years ago, and there were hundreds of people that came. It was one of the biggest moments of my life, and I was so grateful. But one of the things that occurred about 2 weeks before is that Gary called me up, and he was very upset. And I was like, oh my God, I made Gary Mack upset. What have I done? After all of these years working with him. And he said, the network has given it the title, The Lost JFK Tapes. And I said, yeah, it's kind of a catchy title. They like doing that. He said, they were never lost. They were right here the whole time. And he seriously wanted me to have them change the title. So I actually called the network and said, Gary says the tapes are never actually lost. And they said, it's a great title. We're going with that title. Thank you. During the screening, he got over the title. He thought it was a good title as well. He said something to the group that was there. He said that I was the perfect example of someone who pursues a dream, because it had taken 14 years from the time I'd met Gary until the screening that night that the film actually happened. And it was because of him and because of his efforts. And since then, we have made about a half dozen more of those kinds of films on various events. And we've been very successful at it, and our company's now known for doing that kind of program. And that would not have happened without Gary Mack. So I will always be grateful to have known him and worked with him. And thank you very much.
By nature, Gary Mack was very wary of journalists. I know he was of me, and it took me a long time to win his trust. But the next speaker is another journalist who won Gary's trust, and I know that because he told me so. Would you welcome Michael Granberry of the Dallas Morning News?
First of all, it is an honor to be here, to pay tribute to Gary, to be here with Karen and other members of his family, such good friends as Dave Perry, and two men that I, as a journalist, always looked up to, Hugh Aynesworth and my former SMU professor, Darwin Payne, is here tonight. Both men covered the Kennedy assassination, as you may know. A friend of mine said once that the best kind of a boss is somebody that you can both like and respect. But isn't that really true of anybody we know? It was certainly true of Gary. I both liked and respected Gary and treasure the fact that he got to be a very good friend of mine. I'm going to share a story with you that Gary thought was funny. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, but I ended up writing probably not dozens of stories on the Kennedy assassination, but hundreds of stories. And I have this younger brother who lives in Wiley, and we go at each other all the time. And he accuses me of writing most of my stories about 3 subjects, which appear to be totally unrelated: the Dallas Cowboys, 70s singer-songwriter Jackson Browne, and the Kennedy assassination. And he and his wife say that when they have breakfast, they'll get the paper out and they play a game that's a takeoff on the children's book, Where's Waldo? They will see if there's a Waldo. And they get really happy if there's a double Waldo, if somehow I happen to mention 2 of the 3 in the same story. And they contend that on some occasions I've mentioned all 3. And if that happens, they treat each other to a dinner at Old Warsaw. It's nonsense, but anyway. Gary knew more about a single subject, the Kennedy assassination, than anybody I have ever met has known about any subject. He had a phenomenal encyclopedic knowledge of the Kennedy assassination. I ended up doing what we used to call a high profile, a magazine-length profile on Gary. And one of the people I interviewed was then Sixth Floor Museum director, the late Jeff West. And he had a great line about Gary. He said, "I wish we could download his brain," which was really true. It was phenomenal. I mean, I would be in conversations with Gary about the assassination. And I was very interested in the subject because I'm 63 years old. I was a 6th grader. I was 11 years old in Dallas, growing up just a few miles from here. Many of my classmates, their parents were law enforcement officers or witnesses or whatever. Hugh, I'm sure you remember L.C. Graves, the one of the 2 men who was with Oswald when he was shot by Jack Ruby. His son, Terry Graves, sat next to me throughout my education and often got me into trouble. But anyway, it was a very, very close event for us emotionally. So I was very interested. I mean, I would just be chatting with Gary. One day we were chatting and he mentioned the rooming house where Oswald had lived at 1026 North Beckley. And he said, "You know, one of Oswald's fellow tenants lives in Duncanville. I have his number." I mean, it was like, okay. And sure enough, he did. And the guy had a phenomenal story, which was amazing. The story that we probably worked the closest on, though, was I told Gary once at lunch or something that there was this story that was a part of Dallas journalism folklore about the 2 photographers who took a picture of Ruby shooting Oswald, Bob Jackson, who won the Pulitzer Prize, and Jack Beers, who was then a Dallas Morning News photographer, who took a very similar picture. In his picture, Ruby is lunging out of the shadows, but the bullet has not yet hit Oswald. And I had always heard that the lives of both men had been changed by that. And so I embarked upon this. The story ended up winning a Texas Headliners Award for Best Feature, but I got to be honest with you, 90% of that story was Gary. He was extraordinary. For instance, he said, so I'm calling him up and initially, and I said, I would really love to know, exactly when each photographer took his picture. And he said, here, come over to the museum, to the basement, I think it was. And he gets out all these videotapes and films, and we sit there all day long. And not only did he know, he could see, he told me exactly where Beers was standing, exactly where Jackson was standing, and he could name every single person between the 2 of them, in front of them. It was phenomenal. And then he was able to pinpoint electronically, cinematically, that that these pictures were taken 0.6 of a second apart, and that Jackson, it's a great picture. It deserved the Pulitzer Prize. Beers also took a very good picture. But Jackson benefited to some extent by where he was standing in the line. And this story really came together so much because of because of Gary. I mean, he was just phenomenal. I remember when I was at the Los Angeles Times, where I worked before coming back to my hometown. I would do profiles there, and two of the well-known people I did profiles on, I kind of got to be friendly with. Jackson Brown was one of them. The other one was Bill Walton, the basketball player. And I remember these, just before I came back here, I remember having a conversation with each of them, and they said exactly the same thing. I said, as a member of the media, I would really love to know this, and as a friend, I would love to know this. I said, what is it, you've both been covered extensively, what is it that most bothers you about the news media? And they both said the same thing. They both said, we don't care. Jackson said, I don't care if I get a negative review. Bill said, I don't care if a sports writer trashes me, but we can't stand inaccuracies. As Jackson said, they make my skin crawl. I just want to strangle the person who wrote it because they didn't bother to check. I can't stand inaccuracies. I can't stand it when they get simple facts wrong. And so I really took that to heart. And when I would do a story on the Kennedy assassination, I would call Gary, and we would do this New Yorker magazine-like fact check where I would read the entire story back to him. And I'm embarrassed to say, invariably he would catch 6 things or 9 things, or usually small things. But still, whenever I hung up the phone, I always had the feeling that that story was impeccably accurate because of Gary, because he had been so amazing in, doing the fact check with me. And I know he'd probably appreciate this tonight. I recently sold a book. It's going to be my first book, and it's on the Dallas Cowboys. And then I had an agent call me the other day and said, would you be interested in doing a biography of Jackson Brown? And I said, yeah, when I do this one, but there won't be a JFK book by me because Gary won't be here to fact check it. On the other hand, he would probably say, no, go ahead and do it. And as Jackson Brown said in his song For a Dancer, this beautiful elegy about a friend who died, keep a fire burning in your eye. I think Gary would say that to all of us. Thank you.
That was very special. In fact, this has been a very special night. Again, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Nicola, for letting me be part of this. Gary Mack leaves some pretty big shoes to fill, but he's been mentoring a young man now for 15 years, mentoring a young man who shares his passion. The next speaker is Stephen Fagin. He is Associate Curator at the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. Stephen, please come up.
I used to tell Gary that we had a dynamic very much like Batman and Robin. But in those early years, it was far more akin to Mr. Wilson and Dennis the Menace. Either way, Gary was taller. Let's see here. A typical day at this museum would often begin, end, and be punctuated throughout with a familiar question shouted at me over a cubicle wall. Stephen, are you there? This was how Gary got my attention. Assuming I was there, we'd wheel our chairs over about 1 foot to a shared table and discuss, joke, theorize, and occasionally agree on something. Whatever the result, it always started the exact same way. Stephen, are you there? My coworkers tell me that on my vacation days, Gary might call out my name 3 or more times before finally determining that I was not actually there. Stephen, are you there was my soundtrack. Annoying and endearing. It was also the start of many adventures. The really good days, for me, took us down the hallway to our boardroom when it came time to screen a newly acquired or donated 8mm home movie. We would often receive these films unseen, having only read vague descriptions or having seen blurry screenshots. When a new film arrived, it was movie day, something that got Gary and I very excited. After calling out to me, Gary would inevitably just hold up that distinctive yellow box and jerk his head towards the boardroom. With care and dexterity, Gary would set up the projector, and so many times I marveled at the way he put the arms in position, snapped the reels in place, and aligned the film strip. Gary insisted many times that I watch him carefully. It was a simple procedure, one that he somehow made artistic. Lights dimmed, silence in the room except for the gentle, reassuring hum and rattle from the projector. Tiny dust particles dancing and sparkling in the beam of light as it hit the screen. It is so unprofessional to use the word magical in a history museum, but there was a quiet wonder in the first-time screenings of these home movies, a 50-year-old window into this comfortable world of Kodachrome. Gary was always the projectionist, and sometimes there was an audience. Many times it was just the two of us. These films came from around the country, often promising just a few key seconds of Kennedy footage. Disembarking a helicopter, campaigning in 1960, shaking hands at a shopping center, riding in a limousine, sometimes that limousine. But to reach these key frames, we sat back and first watched barbecues, family vacations, birthday parties, World's Fairs, and inexplicably on one interesting occasion, what felt like 45 minutes of birds. Just lots and lots of birds, nesting, perched, in flight, like an Alfred Hitchcock sizzle reel. Thinking back, it is hard to articulate the conversations that would accompany this silent footage. We would often be silly, or occasionally Gary would point out a specific model of car or a kitchen appliance and tell me some story from his past. I impressed him once with my knowledge of the 1964 New York World's Fair, and it was something he never forgot. A month later, he had recorded a PBS documentary about the fair, and he left a DVD on my chair, one of many thoughtful, anonymous gestures he made over the years. Screening these home movies, there was always this undercurrent of excitement and anticipation as we eagerly awaited the arrival of the relevant Kennedy footage. And then it would happen, and we would both sit up and squint and try to pull out high-definition detail from these shaky little films. Voices raising, we would say things like, "Is that Dave Powers? I think that's Dave Powers. There's the car." Gary would offer an instant judgment on the quality, and on a really good day, he was impressed. We'd often watch a film 2 times in a row, more if we got really excited about some detail. And that was it. We dimmed the lights, stepped back half a century, lived a personal moment with a family somewhere in time, and then we got back to work. Not a bad way to spend an afternoon, really. Since we lost Gary, I have spent a lot of time thinking about those impromptu screenings, attaching great personal significance to those moments, because that's what we do to find solace and meaning at a time like this. Tonight we've heard from several people who have provided unique portraits of Gary Mack, family man, friend, consultant, producer, film expert, disc jockey, researcher, curator. Gary was the sum of those parts, and we each saw him a little bit differently. And the more I think about watching those home movies in the dark, the more I see it as a microcosm of the Gary Mack I cared so much about. Gary, the film expert, handling a film reel, checking the sprocket holes, inspecting it for damage or splices. Gary, the teacher, insisting that I watch exactly what he was doing. Gary, the showman, running the projector and dominating the room. Gary the curmudgeon who could paint a room with colorful language whenever a film jammed. Gary the joker, engaging in silly puns and banter while we waited for the main attraction. Gary the researcher, forever searching for clues in the shadows, seeking fact over fiction. Gary the curator, instantly assessing a film's significance. Gary the producer, always thinking about how a film might be used in a program at some point. Gary the unexpected tech buff, eager to embrace the latest, highest quality digitization techniques while fumbling about with his ancient flip phone and Sony Walkman. Gary the friend, smiling at me in a knowing way across that dancing beam of light as we shared a moment that few could ever understand. Sometimes at the end of a long day, I would get really annoyed when he would suddenly call out, "Stephen, are you there?" And yet tonight I would give almost anything to have him say it just one more time. "Stephen, are you there?" "Yes, Gary, I am here. I will always be here. And you will be with me every step of the way. Thank you."
It has been an incredibly powerful evening. I'd like to extend deep thanks to Rich Ray for running this program this evening. Thank you so much. And you didn't share all the stories that you have with Gary, about Gary. All I can say is that Gary was driven to shine a bright light on a very dark story. And now I hope he's a twinkling star, and that he will constantly illuminate our path as we continue to tell this story for many generations to come after us. Thank you all so very much for coming. There's loads and loads of food, and we want you to eat it, and we want you to mix and mingle. And as I said earlier, many of you don't know each other, but I'm so pleased that there's been such an outpouring of love and caring for Gary, and that so many people from the past have come back to be part of the museum as it is now. So thank you again for coming, and let's give a round of applause to everybody who's spoken this evening.